Almost no one has been explaining weapon classes and types correctly or completely, so today I'm going to break it down properly for you. Combat is a staple feature of any great RPG, and Bethesda games are no different. While combat hasn't always been Bethesda's strongest suit, there's always been some iconic element to enjoy in previous titles. With more enemies and weapons than ever before, I think we're in for something out of this world. Welcome to entry 0.5 of the Starfield Handbook. Mumble here, and today we'll be covering everything you need to know about offensive combat in advance of Starfield's imminent launch. We're talking combat styles and skills, weapon types and stats, mods and munitions, movement and mechanics, and of course, enemies. I'm truly honored by all the support people have shown for this series, and I can't wait to supply you all with comprehensive guides and breakdowns of every aspect of this massive game using actual game knowledge on release. Let's get to it. Combat can be approached in many ways in Starfield, and your choice of skills and weaponry will heavily influence the potency and effectiveness of your attacks. Looking at our options most broadly, combat will be split between melee and ranged, and we'll have both the physical and combat skill trees to spec into respectively for each type, aside from the duelist skill, which is part of the combat tree. Some additional skills tied to combat include stealth, where we can deal extra damage against unsuspecting foes, as well as enemy influencing skills such as diplomacy to stop enemies from fighting, instigation to force enemies to fight allies, intimidation to cause them to flee, and xenosociology for mind controlling enemies. We also have explosives, which we'll talk about later on, and it's likely that there are a couple other skills related to combat, we just don't happen to know what those are as of right now. Let's cover melee combat first, as there's not much to discuss. Personally, I love melee builds, but I have a feeling they'll be completely overshadowed by ranged builds, simply because so many of our enemies also have ranged weapons, and spacing against large hostile creatures will likely be very important at higher difficulties, unless the blocking mechanics in this game can heavily mitigate damage received. Also, the raw damage numbers on melee weapons just don't seem particularly promising. I'll be more than happy to be wrong on this one, and they're actually just hiding away some of the better weapons in the full game, but I can't really picture it without there being some crazy electrified swords or utility weapons that maybe have a high likelihood of incapacitating enemies or inflicting status effects like poison or bleed. It just doesn't seem fitting that melee weapons would ever stand a chance against 300 years of gun innovation. We've seen from game footage that you can be a bare-knuckle brawler with neurostrikes, one of the master skills unlocked through the physical tree, or you can grab a katana, knife, or axe and start slashing. Being up close and personal poses a high risk in general, along with the fact that you'll have to spend some time closing the gap between yourself and your enemy if you bring a knife to a gunfight, so you'll likely need to invest in protective armor or skills to boost that survivability. You'll note as well that certain melee actions seem to drain your O2 meter quite substantially, and it also seems that if you drain your O2 bar too much, that your CO2 bar, which is the red bar, will actually start to fill up as well. I'm not sure if this means that your O2 recovers more slowly, or if you max that out, you become winded, but there's clearly some sort of negative effect that's tied to it. This isn't something you'll have to worry about when firing guns. Something that people might not have caught, however, is that there might actually be a parry type mechanic built into any weapon type, as we can see from this hunting twist fin combat example of it going in for an attack only to be gun bashed and seemingly staggered backwards. They did, however, receive some damage in this instance, so it's hard to say whether they gun bashed late, or if this was a mitigated amount of damage for performing the gun bash, or it actually does nothing, honestly. That is very possible. At least with melee weapons though, it seems like there is a very intentional block stance you can perform. We haven't seen any shields yet, but that would definitely give melee builds more of an edge if they end up being in the game. While it doesn't seem to be explicitly tied to melee attacks, I've noticed this blue bar that shows up over enemies when they get punched or hit by certain munitions, and I'm fairly confident that this is an electromagnetic damage status bar that either stuns or deals a large chunk of damage, or both when it maxes out. We can see the same symbol used on an EM modded laser rifle here. You'll notice from these clips that a big hit to the head brings the bar up a decent amount while also knocking enemies back a bit, potentially being useful for stopping enemies from shooting you temporarily if you can get close enough to attack them. That knockback is likely separate from the bar's meaning, however. We see the Shroomhead Grazer get clocked, a giant chunk of damage registers, and then the bar gets filled to around 20% in that same hit again. So maybe Neurostrikes applies electromagnetic damage, and maybe it has something to do with causing massive internal damage to the target when you max it out. Another place we see this is during this boarding example, where its shotgun appears to be dealing non-ballistic type damage, since we see no kickback happening in 0G, and we see the shot against the Ecliptic Commandant fill up that blue bar almost immediately before our character either turns too far to see the health bar, or that NPC died with the bar maxed out. It's hard to say, but that guy looks either dead or stunned, so there's gotta be something to this theory. I don't have much more to speak to on melee other than that your boost pack, which I think every player should have no matter what, will play a key role, and you'll want anything you can get your hands on that can improve your O2 meter and max recovery. Before we dig into ranged weapons, I'll quickly go over relevant skills in the combat tree that aren't weapon type specific. If you want more details on all of them, I recommend checking out entry 0.1 of the handbook for the full breakdown. Of note is that ballistic weapons gain more range at rank 4, indicating a potential damage falloff after a certain distance based on weapon type if you're firing bullets. Then rapid reloading for better reload speeds, and this one is weapon type specific, but heavy weapons reduce damage taken while aiming down sights, which is interesting. Finally, we can improve our hipfire range and accuracy by leveling targeting, which is great for you CQB enthusiasts who want a run and gun, or live out your space cowboy quick draw dreams. Most of the weapon type specific rank ups seem to be generic increases, but at least most of the rank 4s are something unique like we saw with heavy weapons. Something very important to call out here is that we have weapon types, such as shotguns and pistols, but weapon classes are ballistic for physical damage, laser for energy damage, and electromagnetic for EM. We can infer this from the fact that our armors have these 3 defense types, and we've seen at least one example of each of these damage types on weapons. While we haven't seen the explicit skill recognition for mag weapons, I'm 99% sure that this grayed out skill will be mag weapons, and that it is specifically referring to the class of mag weapons and not the electromagnetic guns with all the lasers coming out of it. Those count as rifles, and I'll explain that shortly. I'm so certain of this that I'll add to my onion eating bet and throw in 5 cloves of raw garlic if I'm wrong on this one too. It's a higher tier skill, which makes sense if that blue bar we just talked about is indeed tied to EM damage, as there's more advanced functionality to it than we've seen from more basic skills like ballistics and dueling, which are very bare bones skills. All this to say, we're going to have many combinations of weapon classes, types, and mods, which we've already seen with a laser pistol, an EM modded laser rifle, and of course run-of-the-mill ballistic weapons like double-barreled shotguns. We're going to be spoiled for choice here. If you're not sure where to be getting your post-release Starfield insights from, I've got you covered. I'll be no-lifing the game harder than 99.9% of people in our solar system so that I can deliver you the most well-researched, tested, and rooted in fact Starfield content there is. Alright, now for the meaty topic, and that's ranged weapons, which we have many options to choose from. We'll segment this into close quarters combat, medium range, long range, and heavy explosives. Everyone likes big damage and things that go boom, so we'll work backwards from this list and start with explosives, as there's some neat stuff to unpack here. We have a few different types of explosives to choose from, and in our inventory they're categorized as throwables. While in combat, we have a live counter at the bottom right of our HUD, and it looks like that number can go quite high, but honestly that could just be because we're watching a display video, as we see a bunch of instances of 999 ammo on other weapons. We have standard time-delayed grenades like frag grenades where you pull the pin, throw, and after a few seconds get a big boom. But it isn't clear whether we can cook frag grenades for more calculated deliveries of shrapnel. Then we have what appears to be impact grenades that detonate on impact, followed by landmines which you can clearly just throw onto the heads of enemies for instant detonation, or alternatively place on a path where you would expect your foes to pass over for a little surprise. Whether it's an explosive you've thrown or an enemy has thrown, you'll see an explosives indicator show up on your screen, which makes me think you can definitely take damage from your own explosives too. The last type of throwable I've seen so far is freeze charges, which release a powerful blast of what is likely some cryogenic material that applies heavy freezing effects to any enemy within the blast radius. I'd expect this has limited effectiveness on larger enemies or ones that may have built-in frost resistance. We also have some examples of grenade launchers and rocket launchers in action. The rocket launchers are pretty sweet actually. They're very small handheld devices, and they look similar to the Peacekeeper from Apex Legends, and after each shot you can see a new rocket being chambered. The final heavy weapon we know of is miniguns for some real crowd mowing power. Sniper rifles are our only long range weapon other than maybe a rocket launcher, and there's nothing too special to talk about here. You can clearly register brutal sneak attacks with their high-powered shots, and you'll be able to select a number of long-range scopes to take people out from a distance. Pretty standard hold breath to stabilize functionality, and interestingly enough, some no-scope action as well. I wonder how reliably you can actually no-scope in this game, and also how third-person shooting is going to feel when going in and out of ADS with certain weapon types. It's really weird because none of the third-person shooting footage gives you a good idea of what's happening to your accuracy when you scope in and out. Moving down the list, we've got mag weapons, which, based on this description, are handheld railguns on steroids.
These are high-powered electromagnetic induction ballistic arrays. Each barrel has its own targeting laser and can dish out some serious damage.
Instead of relying on gunpowder, the electromagnetic force generated propels a projectile forward at high velocities. My thought for why they're designed this way is twofold. First, it looks cooler, and second being that a large amount of heat would be generated in one spot if you only had one channel to launch the same number of projectiles through, which would cause overheating to occur much faster than if you had 25 or 40 channels. By having an array system, you can distribute the heat more evenly, allowing for hundreds of rounds to be fired on repeat. It's pretty much a different flavor of minigun. I will say that those targeting lasers are a little obnoxious. Like, unless the fire area fans out aggressively as you increase the distance, they don't really make any practical sense, and it just seems like a bad design if the channels are not aligned to all fire exactly straight. I think one laser would probably suffice, personally. Keep in mind that while these weapons operate using electromagnetism to fire, the projectile itself is just an object with massive kinetic energy, thus delivering physical damage and not electromagnetic damage, which goes back to our point around weapon classes versus weapon types. Because this weapon is delivering physical damage, you would therefore classify it as a ballistic weapon. Pretty easy giveaway on this as well is the fact that it's called a ballistic array, so pretty fitting. In terms of its type, however, it is interesting that they have classified it as a rifle, but I'm just not going to question it. All that does is simplify things for me, knowing that we don't have a special typeset for this particular kind of weapon. Energy weapons are another firearm of the future, and I'm actually pretty excited to give these a try. They don't have any kinetic kickback, allowing for more stable shooting in low gravity environments, giving you an edge in combat under the right circumstances. The caveat seems to be that their general accuracy is much lower, as you can see the pulses of energy fire off erratically in a general area rather than exactly where you're aiming a lot of the time. I'm also fairly certain that energy weapons is synonymous with laser weapon as a class and not a weapon type, as we've seen energy and laser weapons described together in shipbuilder examples previously as well. This is why we see laser pistols and the EM modded laser rifle. Normally it would have energy damage, but the mod simply swapped its damage to EM. Okay, so next is particle beam weapons, but there's some weird stuff regarding them that I want to address, but I think it's important to first describe what a particle beam weapon is, and to mention that they deal both energy and physical damage, which does make complete sense regarding the tech. These weapons don't fire lasers, which would be traveling at the speed of light, but rather fire supercharged, highly accelerated particles at a fractional amount of the speed of light that pack a much more serious punch to compensate for the lower speed due to physical particles striking the end target. I could see these having some wind-up time to accelerate the particles and maybe even fire in short beam bursts. It really depends on Bethesda's interpretation of the tech. I think the fact that particle beam weapons deal dual damage is exactly why they have a tier 3 skill, and I think they've intentionally saved showing them in action extensively because they'll be an extremely powerful weapon choice. So here's the weird part. We have a clip from the direct that shows particle beam weapons being ranked up, despite the weapon we see being used having an extremely high fire rate with muzzle flash that looks almost certainly like an SMG being fired. I could either be completely wrong on my thoughts around what particle beam weapons will look like in the game, this gameplay footage could just be bunk, or an enemy was killed just before this clip started with a particle beam weapon and the pop-up is just now showing up. If we look back on the only image we have of a particle beam weapon in an inventory, we see an extremely low fire rate on this weapon, which doesn't match up to the insanely fast mag dumping we just saw in that clip. And also note that the ammo type says fuse, making me even more confident in the notion of charging before firing, further explaining the low rate of fire. I'm just not sold on this being a particle beam weapon being used in the field. Continuing on to some more clear-cut types of weapons, we have rifles, which we've seen a few examples of. You have conventional ARs that fire regular old bullets. Then we have that laser rifle modded to deal EM damage, so we know they can cover all the bases on damage types. Rifles will always be a solid all-around pick. Moving ever closer to our foes, we've got old reliable shotguns. We've seen a good few shotgun varietals, but they all do the same thing really well, and that's pump a hell of a lot of damage into anyone dumb enough to let you get that barrel close to them. Our final two weapon types are pistols and SMGs, which will probably shine in close quarter combat locations like labs and other loading screen facilities that are smaller. It's hard to say whether any of the pistols will ever truly compete with any of the other weapon types, but I could see a few legendary pistols having some crazy perks and mods for some 1 or 2 tapping potential. SMGs will definitely be great for spraying enemies up close, and I can definitely see some boost pack pairing working great with them. Of course, we wouldn't be finished here without talking about what could be an entirely separate combat element of its own. We're talking about that final scene from the combat section of the Direct where our hero just pulls out his space wand and Wingardium Leviosas everyone in the room. Honestly, it seems like he just insta-killed them all, but I'm not sure. We know literally nothing more about this wizardry, but my best bet is that it's tied to the artifacts and will either slowly acquire these powers or more likely unlock it at the end of the main campaign. I'd speak more about specific stats on the weapons we've seen, but I think it's a futile exercise since our dataset is so limited and we can't do any meaningful comparisons within weapon types, which I'd argue is much more important than across weapon types. We already know that most weapons either have a specific use case where they'll excel, or they're a weapon archetype that is naturally going to be stronger than other weapons. For example, comparing a pistol to a rocket launcher probably isn't very useful. Now that we've covered every weapon type, let's look at what kind of mods and perks we can outfit our weapons with, and a very quick look at item rarity. We've currently only seen normal, rare, and legendary items, and the core differences is that you get 1 bonus perk from rare items and you get 3 from legendary items. We've not yet seen a legendary weapon, only this helmet as a reference point, but you'll notice 3 stars on the legendary item while rares only have 1. I think it's safe to assume we'll have 1 more intermediate item tier, perhaps epic, that will fill in that 2 perk gap. With regards to weapon perks, we've actually only ever seen 3 from the 3 rare weapons that we see in that quick inventory pass from the Direct. The first being Exterminator, which gives us 30% damage against aliens, so pretty much any non-human character, unless we pulled a Noah's Ark in space and brought a bunch of animals to make a new Atlantis zoo or something. Then we've got Hand Loading, which sounds cool, but could just be saying you get a % damage increase, and we threw in some RNG to it to disguise it as something that's cooler than it really is. If the volatile rounds is an actual munitions type that has some sort of meaningful effect, then this could be awesome, but otherwise it's just numbers. I'd really like to know those actual numbers to better understand how much of it nets out to be an actual buff. I hope there's an option to toggle more detailed tooltips within the game. Our final perk is Bashing, which I think is awesome for CQB enthusiasts. Dump a mag into someone while you close the gap, and then give them the business with the butt end of your gun to finish them off. Onto mods, we get a good look at some of the different options in play, and I think we're going to have a ton of flexibility on this front. I'm expecting there to be some very meta mods that will clearly outshine others, but then there will be some other great options that make gameplay easier, or more convenient as well, that many will opt for, like full auto options to save you from some early onset arthritis. It's impossible to tell right now whether mods will have a direct impact on weapon stats, but I think it's safe to assume that any mod that alters the actual weapon structure itself will have some effect. Keep in mind that those red and green arrows on the weapon overviews are just a comparison of the currently equipped weapon and not a reflection of the mod impacts on it. I'm going to power through these inventory examples in no particular order here. First, we've got a recon scope on a pistol, which is neat to see as it implies that we can do some proper pistol action from longer distances too. I'd probably expect a range boost from something like this, and then the compensator that we see, I'd expect to have some sort of accuracy improvement as well. Next is a long barrel, which should definitely pump up our range and potentially accuracy, iron sights for anybody who doesn't enjoy scopes, and of course extended mags are often a welcome addition to most weapons. However, they do frequently come with an increased reload time. Electromagnetic beams is probably one of the most interesting mods I've seen because I love the notion of being able to change the damage type of a weapon to round out my arsenal. I'm not sure what removed cover would necessarily mean, but that Equinox does look a little exposed, so maybe it's just cosmetic, or it could be referring to something internal that impacts weapon performance. I'm not sure on this one. Let me know if you have a theory. Finally, we have the fully automatic mod, which is pretty self-explanatory. I'm curious if this does have implications on fire rate as well, though. This Ember laser pistol has a laser sight, which is self-explanatory, but the focal lens in my mind means a more concentrated beam that has increased range and or damage. And then we have ignition beams. I'm fairly confident that this means there's a % chance to set the enemy on fire, since we saw that legendary item that had the incendiary perk, which was a 10% chance to ignite enemies as well. Back on the particle beam rifle, we've got some pretty clear-cut mods: long barrel, a laser sight, another scope, and a tactical mag, which may decrease reload time if I had to guess. Last on our list is this A7 shotgun with a classic reflex sight, a tactical stock which may improve accuracy since I don't see any other weapon handling stats, and finally flechette rounds, which should tighten the spread on your shot. If we move on to the research and crafting examples, we have a quick look at a few other mods as well as some specific slots you can mod on weapons. There are numerous research projects we can undertake to unlock more mods for our weapons, each of which cost a combination of materials. It isn't clear whether we can salvage mods off of collected guns, but it would definitely be convenient if we can. In this rifle example, we can see a few options for mod slots, first being receiver, which will impact the firing type of the weapon, then internal, which isn't particularly clear what it will do, optics is clear cut, magazine and battery, which is actually quite interesting because if you enter that mod selection, you'll notice that you have to make a choice between an adjusted magazine size or a different munitions type, and that you can't have both, as we see the drum mag get swapped for the explosive rounds here in this example. Perhaps you can find a weapon with the ability to choose both, but I haven't seen an example of it yet. We can see a couple of interesting ammo types. We've got the armor-piercing rounds and the white-hot rounds, and then some alternative mag sizes. I'm wondering if that small mag will have a much faster reload speed. The final thing we see is muzzles, which is where we'll be choosing between muzzle brakes, compensators, suppressors, and such. There are a few more slots we're missing details on here, so we'll just have to wait and see what those end up being. But we know that somewhere you should be able to mod the damage type of the weapon if it is capable of doing so. And we also saw grip mods in the research projects overview, so that's certainly one of those missing pieces. You can also definitely get underbarrel mods, and I cannot wait to get one of these bad boys. We've covered the heavy hitters, and now it's time to talk about getting around and how some environmental factors will come into play during combat, along with some other general combat mechanics. I've talked about our boost pack a few times already, and I think that unless you want some sort of restricted playthrough, you need to be running and probably maxing this skill out fairly early. We've got no vehicles, and running and jumping consumes our O2 meter, so this bad boy is going to be your best friend through thousands of hours of play. I'm not sure if we have fall damage in this game, but it wouldn't be surprising if we do, so you'll probably need to be mindful of that when you do some aggressive vertical positioning above enemies, and keep a tiny bit of fuel in reserve for cushioning your landings. I'm also curious how different gravities will affect the feel of our boost pack in action. There's a good chance we could get some serious hang time on very low G planets. Speaking of gravity, we've seen that in 0G environments that kinetic weapons provide kickback, while energy weapons do not, which is going to be a lot of fun. I wonder if we can do some rocket jumping or spray a minigun at the ground for some extra lift. If you pay attention to the very first combat interaction from the direct, when our character jumps, they actually stay in the air for quite a bit longer as it's a 0.5G planet. I really hope that we get some greater than 1G planets that make you feel like your feet are glued to the floor. It'll be a whole other experience if we get that crazy bullet drop that would come with it too. We haven't seen any evidence that bullet drop exists in Starfield, but if there is, then you'll need to be very mindful of that during any long-range encounters, so be prepared to calculate accordingly. We've already covered how attacks consume the O2 meter, but your jumps also decrease that meter, along with, of course, any sprinting. Recharge time on the O2 meter and total O2 is something we should be able to improve with skills as well. With regards to reloading, there's not much to cover other than that we almost certainly have mods that impact reload time. It's kind of funny how this revolver gets showcased with the really weird moon clip with the aperture-like covers over each bullet, only for the clip to never rotate while being fired. I hope these weapons actually move properly on launch. Now, when it comes to environmental features, we've seen a couple cool examples at play. First is a pretty standard gas tank combustion when our hero is laying waste to the maggot mob with a minigun. We can see that it sets this poor guy on fire, so this is our third proof point of burn damage being present in the game. The next is what looks like tanks filled with cryogenic fluid, or at least some sort of extremely cool liquids that instantly freeze enemies in proximity of the explosion. You may want to watch out for these, as I'm willing to bet we can be frozen by them too. They do seem like a fun addition though. I'm curious if we'll also have some sort of radioactive or corrosive barrels in the game. Next, we have a quick look at the quick action weapon selector. It seems to not quite fully stop time, but it does slow it down a significant amount. It looks like you can customize to your liking, and you can include your healing items in the loadout as well. During actual combat, we have enemies that only have a single white health bar, while other enemies have a white bar that's accompanied by a red bar, typically segmented into 3 pieces. Every time you clear a white bar, you knock out one of the red bars, and after clearing the final red bar, you'll notice just a sliver of health left on it, and upon wiping out that final white bar, your foe will actually be felled. It seems like this is reserved for more powerful enemies, usually the strongest member of a mob pack like these spacer punks who are level 14 versus their level 8 regular spacer companions. We also have numerous examples of critical strikes being hit, including with melee, explosives, and standard guns. Headshots clearly do the trick with guns, but it's probably some percent chance with other types. Companions can also enter the fray and provide us with protection as well, but we don't have many examples of this in action other than a short clip of Vasco shredding some poor souls. One other neat thing is we have a couple instances of what seems to be a highlighting effect on certain enemies. It looks very much like a thermal camera view, and I'm really not sure if this is some sort of marking tool we use to highlight and track specific enemies, but we see a clear example of only one person being highlighted in a group of enemies while not being ADS'd. I'm really curious to figure out what this one is. My final comment around combat mechanics is where can we not fight someone, and are certain characters off limits or invincible? Is everywhere fair game, or will some of the major cities and Constellation home base be off limits? I know that we see our weapon show up while we're in Neon, and there's obviously a lot of violence that takes place there, so I think that should be open for business. Similar to previous Bethesda titles, I'd expect any of the main campaign Constellation members are unkillable, and they'll just simply fall to one knee and recover shortly after if you try to kill them. Sorry to disappoint any of you sick bastards, but I'm pretty sure kids will also be safe from harm. We've covered nearly every single combat mechanic we know of at this point, but we haven't talked much about who will actually be fighting. I've compiled a large collection of pretty much every enemy we'll be going up against that we've currently seen, but I'll go over things more broadly than anything here. Let's kick it off with the big baddies. We've seen this freakish character a couple of times, and I want to say it's our big bad Deathclaw and Dragon equivalent, but at the same time I feel like there's something even crazier being hidden from us. We've got a few more big boys that seem fairly aggressive, including the Ashta, which we've heard described as a cross between a wolf and a velociraptor, and I wonder if we'll see those hunt in packs. That'd be very fitting. We've heard Todd talk about how some of the more aggressive animals will end up killing the more peaceful ones, so expect to stumble across some animal corpses with threats around the corner. I'm thinking we'll have some territorial type creatures as well, like some mud crabs or maybe something similar to giant encampments in Skyrim, but instead with aliens protecting their eggs that we might want for our alien omelets. We've got a few flying creatures that your melee builds will surely not be very effective against, and then we have some large creatures that appear more peaceful than some of those previously shown. I'm really counting on us having far more than 100 enemy types since we have so many planets to explore, and 100 of them are supposedly capable of sustaining life. It's also going to be a big gripe of mine if we end up seeing two of the same species of aliens on two different planets, since that just doesn't really make sense from an immersion standpoint unless we put them there, or these creatures have figured out some faster than light space travel tech without thumbs. Unfortunately, I think it's pretty likely we'll be seeing creature dupes on different planets, so rip immersion. Of course, just because there are 100 planets that may sustain life doesn't mean that more of those 1,000 planets we can visit won't have humans on it at points of interest where they'll be harvesting resources or up to no good in some sort of smuggler's den on a moon in a far-off system. We have a solid host of humanoid foes to face off against from pretty much every faction if you piss them off enough, but the most prominent hostile factions we seem to come across include the Crimson Fleet Space Pirates and the Zealots of House Varun. We also see numerous Ecliptics, especially during spaceporting combat, but I'm not exactly sure where their allegiance lies, but they seem to have ranks like Commandant and Agent, so there's some level of organization to them. And our final enemy type that we can counter is robots. We've only seen a couple of these House Varun robots, but I'm assuming we're going to be able to fight more from different factions as well. And that wraps up everything for entry 0.5 of the Starfield Handbook. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to engage with it to help appease the holy algorithm. It does help a lot. Also, feel free to check out Patreon for exclusive fun stuff and ad-free viewing of all new long-form content. That's all for today. Thanks for tuning in. If you haven't caught entry 0.4 yet on Spaceship, then make sure to check that out here now. I'll see you in the next one. Peace.